The standard explanation is straightforward. Between roughly 1850 and 1920, rapid industrialization triggered an urban building boom across the Western world. Cities needed infrastructure. Infrastructure was built. The sequence feels logical, almost inevitable, when you read it that way. But then you look at the numbers. In a single decade spanning the 1870s to 1880s, municipal water systems, underground sewage networks, wide boulevard grids, grand civic halls, and multi-story post offices appeared, simultaneously, in cities that had no shared government, no unified construction authority, and in several cases, no reliable domestic steel industry to speak of. Not in one country. Not in two. In dozens. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. What it does examine is scale. Because the scale, once you begin measuring it, stops behaving like the simple cause and effect story that most urban history textbooks present. Start with a city like Vienna. By 1873, Vienna had completed the Ringstrasse, a sweeping, multi-kilometer boulevard lined with monumental civic buildings, an opera house, a parliament, a natural history museum, a city hall. Construction on the full circuit had begun just 14 years earlier in 1859. 14 years. For a project that required tens of thousands of laborers, coordinated architectural planning across a dozen separate institutions, and the simultaneous relocation of medieval city walls that had stood for centuries. Historians point to Emperor Franz Joseph's modernization ambitions. The political motivation is documented. The funding mechanisms are traceable. The explanation is not absent. But Vienna was not alone. And that is where the timeline begins to apply pressure. In the same decade, Paris was undergoing Baron Haussmann's transformation. 60 kilometers of new boulevards, 400 kilometers of new pavements, a complete overhaul of the city's underground sewer network stretching to 560 kilometers of tunnel. All of this while the city remained inhabited, while commerce continued, while the existing medieval urban fabric was demolished block by block and replaced, not haphazardly, but according to a systematic geometric logic that city planners today still study as a near-perfect model of urban redesign. The Haussmann project ran from 1853 to 1870. 17 years. Place those two timelines side by side and the pace starts to feel unusual. Not impossible. Unusual. Move further. By 1880, Chicago, a city that had suffered a catastrophic fire in 1871 that destroyed roughly 17,000 buildings and left a third of its population homeless, had not only rebuilt but had constructed an entirely new downtown grid with stone and iron frame structures, a functional municipal water system drawing from Lake Michigan, and elevated rail infrastructure that would become the foundation of the loop, still in use today. 9 years after near total destruction. Engineering historians note this as a remarkable example of American industrial acceleration. And it was. But remarkable compared to what baseline? Because the pre-fire Chicago had itself appeared with unusual speed. In 1830, Chicago had fewer than 100 residents. By 1860, 30 years, it had over 100,000, complete with a harbor, a functioning rail hub connecting to 14 different lines, and a street grid so precisely planned that city engineers later raised the entire downtown's ground level by up to 12 feet to install a sewage system, jacking up existing buildings while people continued to occupy them. 12 feet. With existing buildings. Occupied. This is documented. This is in the historical record. The explanation offered is engineering ingenuity, civic ambition, and commercial necessity. The question the record invites, without resolving, is whether ingenuity and ambition alone account for the consistency of the pattern. Because consistency is the detail that warrants attention. Not one city. Not one decade. Not one continent. Melbourne, Australia had its Royal Exhibition Building, a structure with a main dome rising 61 meters, completed in 1880, built to host the Melbourne International Exhibition of that year. The building still stands. It was constructed in a colony that had only received its first European settlers 44 years earlier. Calcutta, under British colonial administration, had a municipal water supply system operating by 1870. A city of over 400,000 people in a subtropical climate with brick-lined underground mains. The infrastructure complexity required to deliver pressurized clean water to a city of that density, in that era without modern computing or materials science, is not a minor footnote. It is an engineering undertaking that most contemporary civil engineers, when asked to examine it fresh, describe as ambitious even by today's standards. Buenos Aires completed its first underground sewer network in 1869. Santiago had a functioning municipal gas lighting grid by 1857. Each city has its own explanation. Each project has its documented engineers, its recorded costs, its political champions. The history is not missing. What is missing, or at minimum, under-examined, is a coherent framework for why the timing aligns so precisely across systems that had no formal coordination mechanism. The accepted model of 19th-century urban development describes a diffusion pattern. Ideas, technologies, and blueprints spread from more industrialized nations to less industrialized ones through trade networks, emigrating engineers, and published technical literature. The model is logical. It is partially supported by evidence. But diffusion models carry an assumption that receiving cities needed time to adapt, fund, and locally implement what they imported. Diffusion, by its nature, produces lag. Centers of innovation move first, peripheries follow years or decades behind. The global infrastructure record of the 1850s to 1890s does not consistently show that lag. It shows something closer to simultaneity. Not perfect simultaneity, there are variations, delays, gaps. But the clustering of comparable civic infrastructure across geographically and politically unconnected cities within the same 20 to 30-year window is tighter than the diffusion model comfortably explains. Some researchers who study 19th-century urban development have begun asking whether the standard diffusion framework accounts for all of the variables. Whether there are categories of infrastructure, specifically civic, monumental, and subterranean systems, that appeared with a speed and consistency that points toward something other than organic, city-by-city adoption. The historical record does not answer that question. It only continues to raise it, city by city, decade by decade, each new example fitting the pattern just closely enough to make the next one feel less like coincidence. But it begins to strain when you examine the United States in detail. Because the United States, in the mid-19th century, was not a passive recipient of European urban knowledge. It was developing its own civic infrastructure at a pace that, in several cases, outran the European cities it is said to have been learning from. Consider the American Post Office network. By 1870, the United States Postal Service operated from over 28,000 locations across the country. Not storefronts. Not repurposed rooms in general stores, though those existed too. Across major and mid-tier American cities, the federal government was commissioning and completing dedicated, purpose-built post office buildings constructed in what architectural historians classify as the Italianate or Second Empire style. Multi-story, stone-faced, with clock towers, granite staircases, coffered ceilings, and load-bearing walls designed to last centuries. These were not administrative conveniences. They were civic monuments, built for a postal volume that, at the time of their construction, did not yet exist at the scale the buildings implied. In city after city, Cincinnati, Buffalo, St. Louis, Providence, the Federal Post Office building was among the largest and most structurally ambitious structures in the entire municipality when it was completed. Built ahead of population density. Built ahead of commercial need. Built, in several cases, in cities that were still expanding their basic street grids. Infrastructure before demand. Not once. Repeatedly. Systematically. The same forward position logic appears in the American municipal waterworks expansion of the 1860s and 1870s. By 1880, over 600 American cities had functioning public water supply systems. 600. In a country where, 40 years earlier, urban water delivery was almost exclusively handled by private wells and street-level pumps. The engineering required to deliver pressurized clean water to a 19th-century city was not trivial. It required reservoir construction, pipeline networks, pumping stations with steam or hydraulic machinery, and filtration systems sophisticated enough to reduce waterborne disease transmission, a benefit that, it should be noted, preceded the wide scientific acceptance of germ theory. Several American cities installed water filtration infrastructure before the medical and scientific consensus had fully accepted that contaminated water caused cholera and typhoid. The infrastructure, in other words, was sometimes built before the theoretical justification for building it had been established. Historians explain this as pragmatic civic response. Local governments observing disease outbreak patterns, connecting proximity to water sources with mortality rates empirically, and acting on observable correlations rather than formal theory. The explanation is plausible. It is consistent with documented decision-making records in cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore. But it raises a quieter question. How did dozens of cities independently reach the same empirical conclusion, fund the same category of solution, and implement it within the same compressed window of time? The United Kingdom presents its own version of this pattern, and in some respects a more striking one, because the density of infrastructure relative to land area makes the timing more visible. Joseph Bazalgette's London sewer system, completed between 1859 and 1875, is frequently cited as the foundational example of modern urban sanitation engineering. 1,600 kilometers of brick-lined tunnels, constructed beneath a city of over 3 million people, without disrupting surface commerce, while simultaneously managing the ongoing excavation for the Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground passenger rail system, which opened in 1863. 2 subterranean infrastructure projects, overlapping in geography, overlapping in timeline, simultaneously executed beneath one of the most densely occupied cities on Earth. Bazalgette's engineering achievement is well documented and legitimately extraordinary. The Metropolitan Railway's construction is equally documented. What receives less consistent examination is the organizational and logistical coordination required to execute both projects in parallel beneath the same streets. To know with sufficient precision where one network ended and the other needed to avoid, using survey technology that relied on manual measurement and hand-drawn sectional maps. The precision required was not theoretical. It was physical. And the tunnels exist. You can measure them. Move outside London and the pattern persists across British cities with a rhythm that resists easy explanation through local initiative alone. Manchester completed its town hall, a Gothic revival structure with a main tower rising 87 meters, containing 46,000 square feet of floor space, with a principal hall capable of seating over 1,000 people, in 1877. The building's foundation was laid in 1868. 9 years for a structure that, by any contemporary assessment, would require a minimum of 12 to 15 years using modern construction management. Leeds Town Hall, completed 1858. Birmingham Council House, completed 1879. Sheffield Town Hall, completed 1897. Each building architecturally distinct. Each building constructed within the same stylistic language of civic monumentalism. Each building scaled significantly beyond the immediate administrative needs of its occupying government. Researchers in urban history who study the municipal architecture of this period frequently note what they describe as an aspirational gap, the difference between a city's current civic requirements and the scale of the building commissioned to serve those requirements. The standard interpretation is that civic leaders were building for projected growth, expressing confidence in their city's future prosperity. The interpretation is reasonable. It is consistent with documented rhetoric from the period. But aspirational gap, applied uniformly across dozens of British cities, across the same 40-year window, begins to suggest something more systemic than individual civic ambition. It begins to suggest a shared template, a consistent set of assumptions about what a city's core institutions should look like, how large they should be, and how permanent their construction should feel. Where that template originated and how it transmitted so consistently across municipalities with no formal architectural coordination body, is a question the historical record raises more readily than it answers. Some researchers who study this period have noted that when you overlay maps of civic infrastructure completion dates across North America and the United Kingdom, water systems, post offices, rail terminals, municipal halls. The clustering does not follow the diffusion gradient that trade-based technology transfer would predict. The clustering is tighter. The geographic spread is wider. And in several cases, smaller, less commercially significant cities received comparable infrastructure to major urban centers within the same decade. That observation alone does not lead anywhere definitive. Patterns in historical data invite multiple interpretations, and correlation across time and geography is not causation. But it has led some voices in alternative historical interpretation, a loosely grouped set of researchers, commentators, and independent historians working largely outside academic institutions, to suggest that the standard model of 19th-century urban development may be, at minimum, incomplete. That there may be a prior organizational layer, a set of existing structures, systems, or institutions, whose influence on this period of simultaneous global city building has not been fully accounted for in the conventional historical framework. They have begun in recent years to gather these patterns under a single label. That label and what it does and does not claim is where this examination has to go next. Tartaria, or Tartary in its anglicized form, appears in European cartographic records stretching back to the 13th century. On maps produced by French, Dutch, and British cartographers between roughly 1600 and 1800, Grand Tartary, or Tartaria Magna, is labeled across a vast interior region spanning from the Caspian Sea eastward through Central Asia and into what is now Siberia and northern China. It is not a small marking. On several prominent maps of the period, it occupies more geographic space than any other labeled territory on the page. This is not contested. The maps exist. They are held in national archives, university collections, and digitized databases accessible to any researcher. The label Tartaria was, for a significant period of European cartographic history, one of the most consistently applied geographic designations on world maps. What it referred to, precisely, politically, ethnographically, is a matter of genuine scholarly debate. Some historians treat it as a loose European catch-all term for the Mongol successor states and Turkic tribal confederacies of Central Asia, a geographic shorthand that European mapmakers applied broadly because they lacked specific political intelligence about the region's interior. Others note that the label's persistence across multiple centuries and cartographic traditions suggests it carried more specific meaning than mere vagueness, that European traders, diplomats, and explorers who traveled those routes reported back on something consistent enough to anchor the name repeatedly in the same location. Academic consensus leans toward the former interpretation. The label was imprecise. It reflected European ignorance more than Central Asian political reality. That debate, however, is not where the contemporary usage of Tartaria primarily lives. In the last decade, the term has migrated from historical cartography into a loosely organized body of alternative historical interpretation, present predominantly on video platforms, independent research blogs, and discussion communities that exist largely outside academic publishing. Within this interpretive community, Tartaria functions less as a geographic designation and more as a conceptual label, a shorthand for a proposed explanation of the 19th century infrastructure patterns this documentary has been examining. The core proposition, stated in its most basic form, is this: that the civic architecture, urban infrastructure, and monumental public buildings of the mid to late 19th century were not built from scratch by the civilizations that history credits with building them, but were instead inherited, repurposed, or built upon the remnants of a prior organizational system whose existence has not been formally acknowledged in the mainstream historical record. It is important to be precise about what this claim is and is not. It is not, in most of its responsible articulations, a claim about a secret empire or a hidden civilization in the conspiratorial sense. The more measured researchers within this interpretive space are careful to frame their argument as a question about historical accounting, about whether the official narrative of 19th century urban development adequately explains the scale, the speed, and the global consistency of what was built. Their argument, stripped of its more speculative extensions, can be summarized this way: the physical evidence on the ground, the buildings, the tunnels, the water systems, the boulevard grids, does not comfortably fit the human and material resources that documented history assigns to their construction. And where evidence and narrative diverge, the divergence deserves examination. Historians who are aware of the Tartaria interpretive community generally respond with a combination of methodological criticism and substantive rebuttal. The methodological criticism is the stronger of the two. It centers on the community's tendency to treat visual similarity as evidence of shared origin, to look at a domed civic building in Melbourne and a domed civic building in Cincinnati and conclude, from the visual resemblance alone, that they must share a common source that official history has not identified. Architectural historians point out that the Second Empire, Beaux-Arts, and Romanesque revival styles that dominate 19th-century civic architecture were explicitly international movements, taught in the same design schools, published in the same architectural journals, and consciously adopted by municipal governments across the world as symbols of civic modernity. The similarity is real. The explanation for it within the mainstream framework is also real. The substantive rebuttal focuses on the construction records themselves. Contracts, labor rosters, material supply invoices, newspaper coverage of construction milestones. These documents exist for most major 19th-century civic projects, and they generally describe a recognizable process of human-organized, commercially financed, labor-intensive construction. The records are not perfect. They are not complete. But their existence, historians argue, undermines the premise that the buildings appeared without adequate human agency behind them. Both criticisms carry weight. They are not dismissible. And yet, the pattern questions this documentary has traced do not entirely dissolve under either rebuttal. Visual similarity explained by shared architectural education still does not fully account for the timing clustering. Design schools explain what was built. They do not straightforwardly explain why 600 American cities installed pressurized water systems in the same 30-year window, or why municipal buildings in cities with populations of 40,000 were scaled for populations of 400,000. Construction records explain the documented projects. They do not resolve the aspirational gap, the consistent, cross-continental over-engineering that appears wherever civic infrastructure from this period is examined at the level of specification rather than appearance. What the Tartaria interpretive label has done, whatever its methodological weaknesses, is provide a gathering point for a set of observations that do not have a clean home in the standard historical narrative. Some researchers find the label useful precisely because it is unresolved. It does not demand a conclusion. It demands continued looking. Others find it counterproductive, a term so freighted with speculative associations that invoking it tends to close intellectual conversations rather than open them, by triggering the pattern recognition shortcuts that both mainstream academics and alternative researchers use to dismiss challenges to their existing frameworks. What neither side fully addresses is the simplest version of the question. Not whether there was a hidden empire. Not whether history has been deliberately reorganized. Simply, what is the most accurate explanation for the physical record that exists? The civic buildings of the 1850s to 1890s are not interpretations. They are objects. They have dimensions, material compositions, foundation depths, and load-bearing specifications that can be measured today with the same instruments used to evaluate any contemporary structure. The water tunnels beneath London and Chicago and Calcutta have interior diameters. They have brick counts. They have mortar compositions that can be chemically dated. The physical record is more stable than the narrative record. And the physical record, in certain specific categories, scale, internal complexity, geographic distribution, temporal clustering, continues to invite questions that the current explanatory frameworks answer only partially. That is not a conclusion. It is an observation about the state of the question. Some researchers believe the gaps in the standard narrative are minor, rounding errors in a fundamentally accurate account of how 19th-century cities were built. Others believe the gaps are significant enough to justify a fundamental re-examination of the period's urban history. The Tartaria label exists somewhere in the space between those two positions, used by people who are not certain which interpretation is correct but are not satisfied that the question has been definitively closed. The buildings are still standing. The tunnels are still in use. The maps with the old label are still in the archives. And the question of what exactly was built, and by whom and from what prior foundation, remains for now exactly as open as the evidence allows it to be.